It's a pleasure to welcome now to Tomorrow Coast to Coast, Chris Costello, who is the youngest daughter of Lou Costello, who died in 1959.
Right.
And Chris is here, she says, to set the record straight. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Why is it necessary?
Wow.
Feels good, huh?
Wow.
Why is it necessary to set the record straight?
I think because what has been done on them, especially a movie of the week, books that have been put out on them, never really captured the truth. Everything was very exaggerated, you know, as if to say, what can we give an audience to make sure they'll want to see this or will want to read this? And usually it's aimed at sensationalism. And to me, it was unfair because the man is not here today to defend himself. And the way I look at it is he gave me a lot of love and a lot of memories to last me the rest of my life for only having him 11 years. And it's my way of thanking him, really.
How well did you know your dad, Chris? You mentioned that he died when you were 11.
My memories of my father, up until doing this book, was really the memories of a child. They were not of an adult because I did not have him long enough to really experience knowing him as an adult. As a child, the best way I can put it to anybody was like being at an all-day birthday party. It is really the only way I can put it. He was like a kid to play with. And I think because I came along 4 years after the baby drowned, he was a little bit more protective, which I think is natural, and I was very spoiled. I want the whole world to know I was very spoiled. And, but in doing the book, the nice thing about it was that I got the opportunity to really get to know him as an adult. I saw his good points, I saw his bad points, and I loved him even more, you know, which was the nice experience about doing the book.
How did Bud Abbott and Lou Costello get together in the early days?
Well, that's interesting. Both of them had other partners when they were working burlesque, and they happened to work at a burlesque house here in New York City. Bud had a comic, my father had a straight man. My father's straight man got ill one night, and Bud subbed for him, and after that, it was, they were together ever since.
Now, there's all kinds of stories about they didn't get along, and they feuded, and they fussed. What did you find out?
Well, I think it's sort of like Bud Abbott really described it very well in an interview in 1972 or 73 by saying, you know, we've had our ups and we've had our downs. But you have to realize that we have been together so many years that it became a marriage. We saw more of each other than we did our own wives. But even with those ups and even with those downs, we truly loved one another. And I think he really summed it up in that interview. I really do.
You talked about your brother who died as a baby, and that really threw him for a loop, didn't it?
Yes, it did. I think it can throw any parent, you know, when you lose a child. But in my father and mother's case, what was very tragic about it was that when the baby was born, my father was doing a bond tour, or he was just about ready to leave to do a nationwide bond tour. When he came back, he had contracted rheumatic fever, which put him in bed for close to a year. So during that entire year, he and Butch were constantly together. When he couldn't get out of bed, Universal made him a bed on wheels that could be rolled outside so he could play with the baby. When the baby started to crawl, my father, for therapy, would crawl along the floor with him. So when the baby was approaching his first birthday, my father was going back to work for the first time in a year on his radio show. And he asked my mother if she would keep the baby up that night to see if he would be able to recognize his voice over the air. And it was during the rehearsal that he was called, you know, back to the house. He went on that night to do the show knowing that his son was dead.
Tell how it happened, Chris.
Well, the baby loved being in the playpen outside. It was a story where it was no one's fault. It could have happened with anybody in that home, you know, even my father. But the baby, being a very lively baby, evidently knocked a slat loose from the playpen and managed to crawl from the patio area. It was unfortunate. It could have, as I said, happened with a number of people inside the home.
And it changed him a great deal.
Yes, it did.
We'll get into that. We'll be right back. Chris Costello, and we were talking about the early years when your brother was drowned. and how it changed your father, Lou Costello.
I think one of the important areas was that it changed him as far as his attitude on life. You know, before he was the type of man that was always jovial and joking around, and he just had this zest for life. And after the baby died, a lot of people sensed that worked with him as co-workers that he lost a lot of that inner, zest. He became more within himself. There was a sadness about him. At times when he used to be with the crew and joking around with them in the morning, he might just take a chair off to the side by himself. One of the questions I asked a lot of people when I got into that particular area of research was, did he ever talk about the baby's death? Many of them said, no, not really, but he was just so hurt by it that he couldn't. His closest friend said that at one point he did mention to him, he said, Milt, if I start to talk about it, I'm going to crack.
What about all the money problems? I know that he underwent an IRS audit that was devastating.
It was devastating. I think whenever the IRS comes in, it's
So true.
devastating. It's an interesting story, though, because here is where my father had an unbelievable amount of childlike trust in people. It was like, give me the paper and show me where to sign, and I'll sign. Well, he got involved with a business manager who, as it turned out, failed to file payroll taxes in 18 months, kept asking for extensions, unbeknownst to my father. When the IRS moved in thinking, hey, wait a minute, there's so many extensions, and I don't really think these returns are accurate, instead of going back maybe 3 years, which is normal, they decided to go way back to 1945, spanning 7 years on both men. And as it turned up, it looked as if my father was purposely trying to defraud the government. The business manager had never saved a canceled check, never saved any vouchers, did not save any documents that would be proof.
Now, was there really an auction on the lawn, the front yard, to pay off these debts? Or that's what the movie and the book said.
That's the one area where I did laugh. I laughed very hard. No, that never happened. As a result of the IRS coming in, their penalty tax was knocked off, which meant instead of $750,000, both men would owe $350,000. The home is still standing today with most of the furnishings still inside, and we did move to a very large ranch out in Canoga Park in the San Fernando Valley, so that was not true.
What about gambling? A lot of that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think I acquired it somewhat because when I go to Vegas, I have this thing for the nickel slot machines. But that's it. Yes, he and Bud both loved to gamble, and it started way back in their burlesque days to cut the boredom in between shows. They would gamble for like nickels and dimes, but then when they started getting into the money,
dollars and hundreds.
They used to bet over the telephone. It got so bad. And at one point when my father did get rheumatic fever, it was guess the blood pressure with the nurse. So yes, he loved to gamble, but he really gambled with very good players, and he was not a good player.
What about drinking? Bud Abbott's drinking got to him at one point.
That's true. Bud did have epilepsy. And one of the reasons why Bud Abbott drank was because he was deathly frightened of his attacks. My father could sense an attack coming on if they were doing a scene or a routine, and he used to physically punch him in the gut to bring him out of it. But Bud Abbott was deathly afraid that he would like die in his sleep because of it. And this is why he started drinking.
Is that what made them split up?
I would say it